Hey Bitstocks family, it's David here, CTO. And today I'm answering the question, can you send Bitcoin to a friend from your Gravity account? The answer is yes. And it's really simple. All you need is their Bitcoin wallet address. Log into your Gravity account and click on BSV or BTC under your investment tab. Then click on withdraw, enter the value you want to send, and then the wallet address you are sending to. Confirm your transaction using your 2FA code, and your Bitcoins will be on its way. We don't charge a fee for Bitcoin withdrawals, but remember that there are network processing fees, and they are very dependent on the version of the Bitcoin you are sending. That's it for today. All the best, and until next time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to, I've said this a couple of times, but I really couldn't mean it more, an incredible special episode of the Bitstocks Podcast. Today, I have none other than Dr. Roy Murphy with us, and the first time ever on the Bitstocks Podcast where I felt like I needed a printout to give the history of my guest a bit of justice. Okay, so bear with me. Let me just recite this off. So Roy completed the Mensa at the age of 12 with an IQ of 160. He's now been an elite member of Mensa for over 27 years, if I'm not mistaken. The Stanford IQ test of 173, which was more recently, right? Putting you in a 99.9974 percentile, right? Officially attributing yourself as being a genius, right? With a rarity rate of 1 in 395,000 people. However, his wife still would not call him a genius, right? You trained yourself as a teenage croupier to catch professional card counters by not only dealing blackjack at high speeds on the table, but you was also using interference to lead decision-making as well. I'd love to touch on that. Eventually managing tables of up to 50 players and becoming the secret weapon of the casino and earning the title, The Destroyer. And I think a bit of a surprise for many people who will be watching, you were probably the first commercial Bitcoin miner after Satoshi Nakamoto and the longest running continuous SHA-256 miner. And Roy, lastly, but definitely not least, Roy has been responsible for the last 15 current world record blocks ever mined on BSV, including the latest 638 megabyte world record block. Dr. Roy Murphy, how are you, sir? Thank you, and welcome to the Bitstocks Podcast.
Wow, what an intro.
The longest intro. I feel like a fight announcer.
Do I get a belt or a championship or something for that?
Well, it depends. Depends how many rounds you want to go.
Okay. I didn't understand how much research you'd done in the background. It's really interesting.
Dude, it's pleasurable. It's been pleasurable. I mean, reading up the history and the things it is that you've been involved in, not to mention your book, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a bit, but your holistic view of the world. I see many parallels with how I perceive the world, my role in the world. And what I find very interesting is what it seems like as you're speaking and when I was reading through your book, your compass seems to be yourself, and you always seem to look back to yourself, what it means to be human, the mind, and naturally you then segment that into Bitcoin and sow that into Bitcoin as well, which I thought I was one of the very few only weirdos out there that was making that connection. So without me saying much more, Roy, do you want to give yourself a little bit of an intro and just tell the space and myself, what have you been up to? Who are you and how did you get into Bitcoin?
Wow. Interesting question. So first of all, the reason why I wanted to choose to come on your show more than any other is I remember seeing the show you did possibly even 3 years ago now, where you did the interview with Craig when you were talking about the nature of Bitcoin as being not just a network, but there's also nature and geometry within how Bitcoin works.
Yes.
And at the time, I remember lots of people, you got quite a lot of slack for that because people were saying, this guy's crazy. He's coming up with all these different wacky ideas. And I'm thinking, no, a lot of what you were saying, that there's a lot of information there where even if you're off the beaten track, you actually have the right idea when it comes to network connections and management of data. So to answer your question about how did I get into Bitcoin, pure fluke, pure chance. So I'm old enough now to remember pre-internet. So if you go back as far as maybe 2002, I've been involved in distributed computing as early as that. And not many people realize that there are distributed computing systems that you could do from home in the early 2000s. So about 20 years ago, there's this thing called, I think it's called BOINC. It's the, I think it was the Berkeley Open Institute for Distributed Computing. And they had, you could do mining, or you could actually do computational dynamics using your graphics card on your PCs around 2002, 2003. And it was an open network where you could connect your computer and actually do computations as a grid network. So you could do that. They had like SETI. They had the SETI at Home projects where you could use the idle PC time of your computer to actually do computation for astrophysics, for sky mapping, protein folding. There were all different projects that you could connect in a peer-to-peer manner and actually utilize server infrastructure or PC hardware, whether it's CPU or GPU, to essentially mine information and send it back to the host ship. So you're actually doing distributed computing. And I've been doing that for over 20 years. So I found Bitcoin, or Bitcoin found me, on May the 11th, 2009. So I was very early.
Really early.
Really early. So I had a grid network distribution center when I was living in Cyprus from 2007. And there's a really long backstory there as well. I don't know if that's going to be interesting, but
no, it is. Especially, I'm of Greek descent as well, so I've got family in Cyprus.
Oh, okay.
So whereabouts in Cyprus?
I was based in Paphos, and between Paphos and Limassol, there's an area called Orites, which is where the new wind farm is. And on that track, along that road, there's a big industrial estate, and that's where we set up there in 2007, 2008.
Interesting. Why Cyprus? You never think mining and Cyprus is a very hot country, right? Why Cyprus?
The reason why I went to Cyprus, one is because my brother had just gone, or he was thinking about going to Cyprus in 2007. He'd been in a bad relationship. My next youngest brother is 12 years younger than me. So he'd just left school. He'd been living in Liverpool for a couple of years, had a bad relationship, and thought he came to me for advice, saying, I've got a school friend whose family are now in Cyprus. They've got a business, a bar. Do you think I should go away for a season and go and decompress and go and party for a bit? And I said, that's a really good idea. I said, when I was your age, I was in the army. I was doing this, that, and the other. I was all over the world. Go and travel, go and see people, go and have fun.
Especially after a breakup. That's good advice.
Yeah, I mean, he was in bits. And I remember at the time, I'd been working from home alone. This is before I was married. Working at home alone with the curtains shut all day.
No doubt for you.
Sleeping all day and working all night. So I was working 20-hour days on my own, and I didn't see anybody. And it was all distributed systems, and it was all architectural stuff for government projects and stuff. So I was really, really off the grid, and I'd actually lost the capability of actually interacting with humans. I became such a recluse, and I thought, Roy, I can't do this anymore. This is going to make you sick. And I didn't realize how mentally drained I was at the time. So the whole process of me going to Cyprus was me telling my brother, it's a great idea. And he was due to go there in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, and I beat him there by 10 days. I sold everything. I sold the house, I sold the car, sold everything on eBay, and I was there, and I turned up, didn't know where I was going, with half a suitcase, a little bit of money in the bank, and no idea.
Brilliant.
And it was a challenge to myself to say, okay, can I push myself out of my comfort zone limits to refine myself? So it was a personal journey that just was a whirlwind for 9 months. I mean, I blew away cobwebs when I first arrived in 2007. I walked into a bar and I got the manager's job straight away. So I ended up running a bar. There was a woman who was a good friend of mine who was the manager. She wanted to run off and go and do another business next door. And they said, Roy, will you come and run it? And I said, yeah, why not? That sounds fun. Day shift, night shifts. It was completely different to my computer science history. And
but in terms of social settings and interaction, that's awesome. If you're going from being a recluse and the risk of that, now you're managing a bar. That couldn't be more social.
Well, I then went to the complete opposite end. I turned into an absolute party animal. So I remember for the first 9 months I was there, I partied from midday, which is when I opened. So we used to open at 8 in the morning and we'd go through till 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
But I would start at midday. I'd go through to 2 in the morning where our license said we had to shut. And then I'd drag 300, 400 customers that still wanted to party at 2 in the morning. And I'd party with them till 6 in the morning. And I'd go to bed at 8, get up and go. And I'd do that 7 days a week. I did it for 9 months. And I was absolutely off my face for the whole of that time and carrying on for the following year. And I met my wife there as well. She was my first hire. And I was only successful at that because she was so wonderful and she continues to be my support and savior through the whole thing. So there's that story of how I got to Cyprus. One of the reasons as well that I figured out very early, around 2007, Cyprus went from the Cypriot pound to the euro, and as they entered into the EU. So Cyprus, one of the issues they had of going into the EU, apart from the fact they couldn't afford to do anything and they'd fiddled the books and the numbers for so long, when you understand that the EU laws over monopolies apply the same as they do to the rest of Europe. So if you can imagine, go back in the UK for existence, you've got National Rail in the 80s, that got privatised under Margaret Thatcher. You then had British Telecom got split up because of these monopoly rules. So in Cyprus, you have the National Cypriot Telecommunications, which is SITA. To be part of the European Union, they had to break up the national telecommunications of Cyprus. And they had to allow competition for other people to come in. The same as in the UK, you have BT. They sublet it out to other companies. So they own the lines and they sublet the services, whether it's the marketing or the actual servicing of the accounts, to other people. And it has to be a percentage so that the governing body doesn't own more than 51%. So you don't have those monopolies. So around 2007, they opened up those non-monopoly rules. So there was a massive opportunity for people like me who had worked with domain naming systems and bringing internet. There was lots of money coming in from China, lots of money coming in from Russia. So with a friend and with a few business associates, we brought some backbone data pipes all the way from Russia through Turkey and then in between Limassol and Paphos, where there's a landing station.
Okay.
So I wanted to set up there a telecommunications hub for doing white labeled mobile telephone systems, landlines, and all the services in between. So domain registration. So all of that could be white labeled and could be resold. So I created these white labeled services from an area around Paphos. So we started doing grid systems, distributed systems, and I thought that would really take off. The reason why it didn't take off the way that I'd hoped is that being a British expat living in Cyprus, and I do speak Greek, but the way that the history of Cyprus is with how, everything's backhanders.
I know.
If you get stopped by a police, you either give them money or they want to know who your father is. And if they know their surname or you go to the same church that they do, then you're okay. So the amount of money you have to give them when you've been drinking. Everyone drinks and drives. Everyone smokes. Everyone gambles and does all those things.
But you must pay.
Yeah, you must pay. That's That's the English. You must pay. You must pay.
So you got the real duality aspect, right? So you went from being a recluse, now you're in Cyprus, partying, and that laid down and doing distributed systems. And that was 2007, 2008, I think now. So then 2009, you're still in Cyprus?
Still in Cyprus until 2011, came back to the UK in 12, went back for a year in 13, and then I've stayed back in the UK since 2014. Mainly because there's property out there, and we've had to... Everything that happened in 2008 with the Cyprus crash that everybody knows about, where when you think that there was 1.1 million people in Cyprus in 2008, 450,000 Cypriots and 650,000 British expats. And over the course of 2008, about 90% of them left. And there was a big boom where we started doing developments for our distributed computing. So they were building these buildings because they had all this expat money coming in to build businesses. The developers went crazy and built all these massive stadium-sized buildings and didn't put facades on. So property became really, really cheap, but the people left. So when the people leaves, the value that they bring with it leaves as well.
Yeah.
So that was one of the driving forces for leaving later on. But I remember that whole sequence of hundreds of people queuing up at the ATMs, trying to get money out, and the government actually stealing their money. So you can imagine around about that time later on when Bitcoin came out, the whole narrative about people not being able to steal your money, that resonated really well with people in Cyprus.
Yeah.
So distributed systems became a bigger thing for me, more than the white labeled services, which I thought would be our primary service as a provider. We ended up doing a lot of stuff in the UK with universities for distributed computing because they didn't always have capacity, and we were like the rollover for some of this computation. And so what we used to do is we used to use the idle time to do computation for projects that were community projects. So in May 2009, I had on this computation email address, we had an email come through talking about this thing called Bitcoin. And that's only because it was considered a distributed system. And I had I mean, I remember the days of things like BitTorrent and, seeding and leeching. And so I understood the concepts, but never really played with it properly. So it was one of those things, I must try it, I must test it. And all of our servers were all Linux system, and Bitcoin was originally released. There was no Linux binaries to actually start running it on a Linux machine.
Yeah, I saw this. You was the first to the punch with that, wasn't you?
It was only out of necessity. So I'd spent the previous 2 years. I'd actually been my own systems administrator because I have trust issues with people. When you have sensitive information on servers that you control, to have someone, a lot of the validation that I have to do is there's a lot of secrecy, especially with some of the government contracts that I do, especially from my intelligence background with the army and the military and the MOD and all the other agencies that came after that.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that.
We can get into that later.
We're gonna get into that. Yeah.
So that's another avenue that's taken me the last 20 years. So
my curiosity is when you first came across Bitcoin, clearly based on what you just described, you had the right format to receive that information correctly, right? But to stay on it and to continue to do it for as long as you have, that's what I find quite unique, because I came across Bitcoin nowhere near as early as that, but it was a few years later, around the hack forums. People were talking about it. I just thought it was a new knockoff version of PayPal or Liberty Reserve. I just didn't take it seriously at all. So it took me a little while to take it a little bit more seriously. Did you have that wave in your own mind?
No, I didn't really know of, I'd never really heard of Liberty Reserve. I'd never really understood cryptocurrencies previous. I had I really didn't understand. I tried to understand the concept, and I thought it was really interesting to have a distributed system. And I tried to understand, the first thing I wanted to know is how proof of work worked. And I wanted to know the security methods used in Bitcoin that were the most profound and compelling to me for actually having something that didn't require that third party. That was the thing that I found most intriguing. And then obviously being inquisitive, I wanted to understand the code. So you go on SourceForge, and I think around about the time it was Bitcoin version 0.1.4. So it was only the fourth iteration of Bitcoin that came later. So going back to the Linux systems, I wanted to run it on my machines. I didn't have any Windows systems. Bitcoin was built primarily for Windows. So I had to get it up and running on Linux. And I didn't even realize later that there wasn't an official Linux version until the November of 2009. I did this on probably, I think it was the 13th of May. So it took me a couple of days to get there, and I just had it running in the background. So I managed to create what's called a cron job to understand the limits of whatever server they were running on. So I had them set up on multiple machines and I had multiple nodes. And they would kick in when the CPU went down below, I think it was 30%, 25%, it would start mining. The Bitcoin daemon would start mining.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, bearing in mind there was no value, there were no exchanges, you couldn't really do much with it apart from have someone you could send peer payments to. And again, there was no UI, there was no graphics user interface, there was no wallet visually you could see. I had it running on Linux, but there was no user interface. So everything was done on command line. So it was very easy to forget about. And that just kept automating. And to be honest, I didn't really pay much attention probably until the tail end of 2010, working on like merge mining systems. Which I found was interesting when you go on the forums and they're talking about things like BitDNS. This is the kind of stuff that Maxthon are doing now with their browser. They're trying to do DNS in a different way. I was really into DNS because we were doing DNS services. I am a domain registrar for the whole of Europe. So I was providing domain systems. I thought, how can we do for me as a company to register a domain, the certification for ICANN, to do that, there's a cost involved. So I thought I can charge cheaper if I don't have to go through that certification process, and I can do it on the blockchain. So these were the ideas that we were having mid 2010, thinking that there's something here.
Yeah.
And if you go back as early as the first altcoin or the first alt chain, which is Namecoin, the original idea for that project was to do it on Bitcoin as a sidechain.
I remember. Yeah.
And I don't know what happened in between us starting there and it turning into some other project that was merge mined. There was no reason for it not to be an overlay-led network or some kind of quorum. And it ended up being released as something that later on you had Litecoin, you had all the other coins come up, and they were all rip-offs to create other markets.
The thinking in the early days was very around how do we improve Bitcoin? All the ideas were around Bitcoin. I don't want to go too deep into the Bitcoin story just yet, because I do want to go straight to the beginning, which is Mensa at 12.
Okay.
So run me through that. I appreciate it came from your grandfather.
Yes.
But just run me through a bit of your family history. So even your grandfather and then you being 12 years old and going and taking the Mensa, which you got a score of 160. Just run me through that period of your life and then the subsequent years after. Yeah,
my grandfather, he was very dear to me. He was one of three male icons in my life who created the person that you see today. Very, very influential over many of the things I did. I loved him dearly and I miss him dearly. And if you notice in the back end of the book, I actually do talk about the impact that he had on my life. My stepfather wasn't the best. My father left when I was 3 years old, so he ran Playboy casinos in London, in Tottenham Court Road in the late 70s.
Okay.
And he left to go to South Africa in 1980. And he ran Sun City for Sol Kurzner. So he went away and left, and it was just me and my mother. And we had, my grandparents were very, very influential in terms of giving me that stability that I needed at a very young age. And because I had a really inquisitive mind and I always asked questions, my children are very, very similar in the way that they are so inquisitive and so hyper-focused on topologies and visualizing. There's something within the visual cortex that is just enhanced. And where the mind is kind of directed to these concepts, it's lacking in other areas, such as social skills. So when I was a kid, there was no such thing as ASD. There was no such thing as Asperger's. There was no pigeonhole to stick someone to help them fit into society in the way that is expected of you. And as a parent with children, once you understand the social aspects of the way that, the dynamics of having to talk to people, talking to you on camera now is something I find, it gives me great anxiety. And that's not because I can't talk. It's not because there's a disconnect somewhere in the brain that makes it overwhelming, where you say something and you wouldn't say, if I was talking to you and we were sat in the pub and we're having a drink, the conversations that we'd have, I'd find much more comfortable because I'm not in a social situation where other people are watching. And I think lots of people get that. Yeah. My grandfather was very influential in the terms of he was the person that introduced me to computing. So there were certain situations that happened as a child. So I was 7 years old when I met Tim Berners-Lee. And this is pre-World Wide Web, pre-internet. We lived in a place in Southampton. And obviously Tim was still at Southampton University. He was still a lecturer. And my grandfather was head of Social Security. So he was a senior civil servant. And then in his offices, during the summer holidays, we'd go and see him, but he would take us to work. So I'd see these big offices and I saw Tim and his team. So their next door neighbor was also the head of the infrastructure for IT for many of the universities in the UK. He was actually teaching computer science, and he was the guy who lived next door to my grandparents where I was born. So I had all these different people being met. So I saw a modem being plugged in to create one of the very first UK intranets, probably in 1982, which is way pre. And I remember my grandfather talking to me about computing systems. So I was talking about computing with a screen. You had the old systems with the green screen or the orange screen. So he had those in his office, and they used to have all these things on the wall where they'd print out. So rather than pictures, they'd do dot matrix images with dots on paper, and they'd hang them up as certificates on the wall. But I remember speaking to Tim, being introduced to Tim Berners-Lee really early, and his way of teaching. Also, he's also one of those people who thinks very differently. They find it difficult to say things, but if you can visually show someone something and actually describe it and say, this plugs into here and this does this. If you talk about images and stuff, these are things that really triggered my imagination. I mean, it's like me with my 3-year-old who's now obsessed with dinosaurs. It's not just I need to know about dinosaurs. She knows more about dinosaurs than anybody because she obsesses about it. She has OCD. She learns from her big brother. It's that method of learning where you find interest in something and then you just absorb everything and you want to know everything and you hyper focus on something. Reminds me of someone that we both know. So these are concepts that came really, really early. So I was given my first PC when I was 1983. It was an Amstrad. Green screen. So I remember my very first programming was around about 8 years old.
Wow.
So my first computer language was BASIC, and I made a program called Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. Mm-hmm. And the computer came with a really, really thick book. And it was the most complex example of how to use BASIC code to create an application that not only runs, but it will ask you a question at the end. And whatever answer you give it actually creates a database of the question. So if you get that question wrong the next time, if you do animal, vegetable, mineral, when you think of something and you do the guess, it had 3 for each. And every time you answered the question wrong, if it didn't get the question right, you add the entry. So if it didn't guess that you had a ferret or something, you asked the question, and the answer that it got wrong was the correct answer it should have got right if it asked the question. So I was actually creating a database of information where the computer would learn the questions. And I played with that for literally 2 years.
Brilliant.
And it became such a massive, it wouldn't run on that machine anymore because it was only 64 kilobits of memory.
That's your first full block.
Yeah, it was my first full block. And this is the time where you had a data recorder on the side. It was literally a cassette tape. And you used to have to put it into the modem and then play it on the data recorder. And you have to wait 20 minutes for what you've already programmed to load on the screen. And then you'd have to then press the record button and the play button together to actually record the program that you've made. So that was my first interaction with programming. So it's very, very young. And then so my computing history, that was it. I was hooked. So I wanted to learn everything about screens and about I was taking things apart.
So when did all of this stuff go internal, right? So just some of the pieces in Roy's book, you speak about history, you speak about religion, you speak about biology, the mind, DNA, RNA. You clearly absorbed information and then you started to apply it to self, right? And it seems like your journey, from my perspective at least, just reading through some of your the stuff that you sent me online, it seems very clear that you start to explore inner space. So how did that start to change your perception of the world, how you navigated in the world? And ironically, identity is something that I really like to talk on as well.
Sure.
Yeah, just tell me when all that stuff started to come together.
When I'd left school, I'd gone, I did my A-levels, and then I went straight from doing A-levels into the army. So you end up living in a bubble, of a closed bubble where you do the same things, you eat the same food, you commune with your fellow brothers and sisters now. It didn't suit me. For various reasons, I ended up moving in the military. One, because I lost my driving license, and one of the prerequisites for joining the Army Air Corps is you have to do Bowser duties and tanker refueling and stuff like that. So I was sent to Leckensfield to do my HGV training, and then I had to go and change. I had to go to court and plead guilty for driving when I shouldn't have been without insurance. I was young and stupid.
As you do when you're young. As you do.
There is a backstory there as well. So when I joined the army, so in the UK at that time, you couldn't do your HGV lorry training until you were 21, and it was considered an honoured and a privilege to do it at the age of 18 or 17 when you could get your driving license in the UK to be able to do the testing, but it's only for military personnel can do that. And when I was 13, 14, I was such a tearaway. I used to take my motorbikes and go over the heath and ride all over the place and go over the dunes, and then drive home with no lights, no number plate, no registration, no insurance. So I was always getting caught by the police. I was 13, 14. And I just did it. I didn't care. So by the time I was actually legally allowed to drive, I was unlicensable because I couldn't get insurance. I was uninsurable until I was about 25. I couldn't get insurance on anything. So that stuck with me. So I needed to drive. I needed to get somewhere. So I drove, but I didn't have the insurance. And it was kind of a risk versus reward. Do I, don't I? So I got caught. I paid the price, and I thought, okay, you can go and get your points on your license cleared if you go to court and you explain the reasons why. And they banned me because I asked them to ban me. Because then 3 months later, I'd have no points. I could do my driver training, and I could continue doing my military training. So I was an avionics engineer. So I was working on helicopters in the army. Again, that all ties back to Bitcoin in history, because all the avionics systems, they use Forth as the programming language on many of the avionics. Missile systems, all that. So that was my first foray into Forth, which I didn't think I'd ever use again. But going back to the army, so long story short, I came out the army, and then I joined the fire brigade as an engineer. So I was training to actually do designing. So I don't know if you know some of my history. So I did my bachelor's in computer science. I did my master's in automotive engineering. I did my PhD in theoretical computer science. But my passion was always racing and cars. Okay. So my whole idea was to be an automotive engineer. I had friends in Formula One. So where I live very close to Silverstone. And there's a 30-mile triangle of every single Formula One, apart from Ferrari in Maranello. They're all based within 10 miles of where I live. And I have lots of friends who live in my village who all work for Mercedes and AMG. And
I've never, ever said this, but the only time I almost went down the educational route was Oxford Brookes University because of their motorsport engineering course.
Yeah,
brilliant. I almost done it, and then I pulled away and I went down the finance route. But it was such an interest to me. Such an interest.
Well, there's a racer in me somewhere. Whether it's bikes, whether it's cars. So there's that history there. So I really wanted to be involved in Formula One. That was my passion, racing. So when I was at Bournemouth Airport, when I was doing my firefighter training, so it was a prerequisite for some of the stuff I ended up doing later. So I ended up working for a company called Cronenbauer, designing crash rescue vehicles for airports. They're the fire trucks, the really big things with the 6-7 foot tall tires, 6-wheel drive. We'll have 40,000 gallons of water, we'll spray. So I ended up designing those. And I went to California to do that as well. And then I came back to Bournemouth Airport and ended up working for the Civilian Aviation Authority, which is a regulatory body for airports, firefighters, and it was the tying in between my training on the airfield, my airfield training from the Army Air Corps. So it all kind of tied in with the engineering side. So I thought I really want to do engineering related to vehicles. So that's how I ended up going back to university. I did my master's of automotive engineering because I thought that would be a shoehorn in for Formula One. So I did my placement year in year 3. So out of 4 working years or 4 study years, there's 1 placement year in year 3 to do a 5-year master's. So part of that was so in the second year, I ended up working for Williams Formula One at Grove. Thinking that I was going to get a position at a Formula One team once I'd finished my course. Which didn't turn out. Just never got the opportunity for whatever reason. So I ended up working at MG Rover. So MG in the UK is a big car manufacturer for all of our US, North American friends. So I was on the design team for the replacement of the K-Series engine.
Okay.
And then they went pop in 2005, 2006, or whenever it was. So I was left with no position, no job. And it was around the time that, the global collapse and recession. So I think I needed to fall back on something, which was the computer science, which I started off with, which was my childhood passion. So I'm then getting work as a software engineer. I'm flitting from one contract to another contract. And then it's all going back to military contracts again as well. So I ended up registering for, intelligence contracts for government issued things. So you register with the FCA or the FSA. for doing financial stuff. I've done banking systems. So I had 10 years worth of contracting under my belt for all different things. So it was gaming, banking systems, fintech. So it was a very broad spectrum, and it was all related to enterprise architecture. So I did my time as a developer. I did my time as a senior back-end engineer. So a lot of it is to do with architecture, engineering, networking, distributed computer systems. So I'm a little bit of everything. Like they say, like a jack of all trades, master of none. So I thought, well, let's take that to the next level. Let's do enterprise architecture, where I can understand enough about how things are built, how software should be built in an agile way, and then create an environment where I'm wanted and needed, and I don't get bored doing one thing. Because of the way that my mind works, I can hyper focus on one thing, but if that one thing doesn't lead to me understanding new things about myself or about a certain subject, then I get bored really easy. I just switch off, and once I switch off, there's no switching it back on again.
So when did you tune into the humanitarian standpoint, as in who are we on this pebble that we call Earth, and the history that predates this very moment, our cellular composition, what that means in terms of when you're looking at a network? When did that journey really kick in?
A lot of that came from my grandfather. So at Christmas and birthdays, rather than give you presents that would be toys and things like that, he'd give me an Encyclopedia Britannica that had my name on or something, because he knew how much I would sit there for hours as a child and obsess on one thing and learn it. So one of the very first things he gave me when I was about 5 years old was an atlas of the world. And I'd never been on a plane. I'd never been abroad. In fact, I hadn't even been out of my county as a child. We didn't go anywhere. For some reason, my parents never took me anywhere. I was always, children should be seen and not heard, and go off in your bedroom and play, which is very different to how I raised my children. Only because I knew how lonely I was. When you're left to your own devices, you end up, as a child, I had these imaginary friends like children do, but you end up you personify them and give them characters that you can have. You always have a friend within yourself when you're alone or lonely. And you can see how people end up, it's almost child abuse to a certain extent, because you're not giving this information. And I think my grandfather was really aware. He wasn't there because we lived so far away, but we'd go there in the summer and he would always be trying to extract. Everything was fun, but it was always learning. And he'd give me reference books to go to. So I'd have these atlas of the world, and he would send me tests. He'd write me a letter, which would come to the house, and he'd say, what is the capital of this country? What's the population of here? Where is this country in relation to this, that, and the other? And this is like 5-6 years old. And I obsessed, and I was looking at the indexes, and because I didn't know then, because I was always regarded as some kind of child prodigy, I rebelled because I didn't want to be a performing monkey for someone who's, Roy, do that thing. If I give you this card, how many of these? And people would understand that I was strange enough that they would test me. So I had kids at school. They would say, in my parents' house, how many stairs? And I'd know instantly. And I don't recall ever counting the stairs in their parents' house. 22. And it would freak me out, because I'm like, I don't remember counting the stairs in your parents' house. I've been there once. And they'd say, how many tiles in my parents' kitchen? And I'd know 321. And they'd be like, what? And they'd go and count them. And I didn't know myself how I knew it. So I knew there was something. I have a visual, it's really hard to say because I forget names all the time. If you give me a shopping list, if I don't take it, I can't remember the things on that shopping list because I don't care. I've written it down, or my wife's written it down for a certain reason. I'm going and I'm going to refer to the list. If it's something I care about, or it's something that I can picture, or if it's something text, then it gets ingrained for a long time. So that's why I get to absorb information. If I immerse myself in that, like I do, and I obsess about it, it's not just, I'm going to learn this. I need to learn everything And then I see it as a neuron. I need to know all of the ways that these are connected to all the other things. So I'm always asking myself questions. So as a child, I was very inquisitive. And then there was one other person, a guy called Peter Musto, who sadly died very, very young in his 60s. And he was the father figure that I actually looked up to. He was actually the father of a girlfriend of mine, who became more of a father figure than anybody else ever did. So I go back to my father leaving when I was 3 years old. I didn't then see I have a very good relationship with my father now. But from the age of 3 until the age of 29, I didn't see him for those 26 years. He was abroad, traveling the world, doing his thing. He had other children. He married. I went to his 4th wedding and his 5th wedding, who was actually the same woman. And now he's been married for a 6th time. So there is something there within the family on the Murphy side. That there's something not quite, I wouldn't say normal. There's a
wonderfully unique.
Wonderfully unique, yes.
Wonderfully unique. Because I find all this stuff really interesting, right? And especially when, say, for example, I'm consuming content and that person is interflecting, right? And it seems like there must have been some very profound realization moments that has someone going as far back as it is that you went to in order to construct and understand the reality is that we're living today.
Well, that second person, that Peter Musto, so I want to mention him, one, because he's sadly no longer with us. As a human being, he was, I'd never, where I grew up, I had never met anybody with the amount of compassion for humanity, humans, and a quest for understanding knowledge about ecosystems and ecology. He wasn't, I wouldn't call him an eco warrior, but he worked for the Water Board, for the Fisheries Commission. He understood the way that everything in the world is connected, especially nature. And he'd be very in tune with animals. It doesn't sound right when you say it.
It's a safe place and space. I told you, we can speak freely here.
Yeah, thank you. So one of his passions, so he was into anthropology. He wanted to understand the history of humanity. And the way that he'd walk you through, we'd go to where the Preseli bluestones were, where those bluestones were the same stones that were transported to the what's the rings in the UK where the Druids go?
Stonehenge.
Yeah, so it's where the Stonehenge stones were quarried from, and he painted a picture where I could visualize something that I wasn't really interested in before, and I thought, okay, this prehistory stuff is really interesting. So I do lots of research on my own because I am a sponge. So I used to read all of his books on history, and so I've had no formal training on things like, I would consider myself a physicist because there's not much physics that I can't do. And I try to tie the links between physics and chemistry and physics and biology. I have an interest in genealogy and genealogy, which are very two different things. One is the study of genes and one is the study of heredity. And also, being a child that didn't know much about his family history, I've done lots of genealogical research on both sides of the family, to the point where I obsessed about it so much. I've found 4,500 on one side, on my mother's side, and 7,500 people on my father's side.
Okay.
And so these things, it's obsessing about the finer details of something. If I don't know something, it drives me crazy. So you ask one question, it has a leading effect to another one. So I have a very broad spectrum because there's just this innate drive. It's this fear of not understanding something or not perfectly getting it in such a way that when you write it down, you can explain it in such a succinct and beautiful and just a beautiful way that when I try and tell you over the camera, I make it sound really, really convoluted because there's so many things going on. There's so many tangents. I keep going off all the time.
I'm totally following. And so quantum physics, biology, wave particle. Run me through your understanding of that and how that applies to, I guess, some of the work that you're doing or looking at with Bitcoin. Your original comment about finding my conversation with Craig interesting, because that's kind of the crux of it as to what I'm speaking on there too. What are you seeing with a statement such as Bitcoin is the first biologically inspired network? You as a polymath, and the understanding is that you have, what do you think Craig means by a statement like that? And what do you see, Roy?
So when it comes to the biologically nature-inspired aspect of Bitcoin or anything in any kind of network system, there are many correlations, and they don't necessarily, correlation doesn't always mean causation, and some of them may or may not be deliberate. So when you had that conversation with Craig, you can see he was kind of saying, actually, yes, what you're saying is correct, but it's almost like I didn't intentionally create these things, but I can see how they are they're either correlated or they are connected. As long as you're aware of the correlations and connections, you can do something with that information. And if you understand it in such a way, it can actually be useful. It can be another string to your bow. So I'll try and give you an example. I know you said you wanted to talk about identity at one point. So if you look at Bitcoin in terms of how wallets work, especially hierarchical deterministic wallets where you have XPubs which generate new addresses every time you create something, which is the ideal way of transacting in Bitcoin. If you look at how identity can be attested at the Bitcoin level, if you understand the way that certain wallets work, if you want to be able to do identity on chain and you understand the looping structures and the scripting structures of Bitcoin, you can actually use derivation paths in the wallet structure, which is the Bitcoin level foundation. It's one of the functions of Bitcoin is the wallet structure, which you can have third-party services on top of. But they give you an example, Gravity on Bitstocks, I imagine will have a wallet within the system. I'm sure it does. But that doesn't power the whole system. It's one function of how the banking operation of how Bitstocks works in the back end and how it interacts with Bitcoin requires some kind of wallet system. So I'm sure you also have identity systems and KYC systems and AML systems that are probably third-party systems for the whole validation and being regulatory compliant. So those compliant things are third-party systems, but they could be integrated as part of the actual wallet system. So I've been exploring this for a little while now. If you look at derivation paths, they're called B trees or binary trees because the pathways are either 1 or 0. So the addressing system is either on or off. And depending on how many of the systems, so if you go back to something like Bit32, they have the definition for the pathways, these generated paths, these derivation paths that tell you where the information on which chain lies where. So these HD keys, so you can have these wallets and accounts. So I tried to figure out, how do you do something like identity? I've looked at, there are many people working on identity in Bitcoin right now. When I say Bitcoin, I always mean BSV. So you're looking at the protocol level, which is now set. How do you get something like identity that can be attestable but private for the individual? And I've seen that there's a few companies that, at the last CoinGeek conference, for example, talking about different systems. A lot of people are on the right path, but I'm not sure they're on the correct level of where that information should be stored.
On that, from what I've seen on the whole ID subject matter, there's a lot of chefs that are aware of the ingredients, right? I've yet to sample a cake, right? I've yet to sample, a chef has yet to cook up a good cake, but are very well versed in articulating all the different individual ingredients, but I've yet to see a good cake being produced. Why is that?
I think it's because everybody for so long has been trying to create different chains of different tokens of different protocols that change constantly, and trying to look at creating a functional business that is viable. And they're not thinking deeply enough about vertical integration of products and services. So if you look at the very lowest layers of the type of services that Bitcoin requires for you to build on, as soon as you take the power away to say, actually, we can't mess around with the protocol anymore, then how do you do all the things that all these guys at Ethereum are trying to do? So they are, in terms of things like token development, 4 or 5 years ahead, because they have the marketing, they have the funding, they have that massive learning curve. And they have a structure that, in terms of building applications on top of, are now starting to get more advanced. Whereas their problems are now the lower layer of the actual Ethereum protocol and the token systems and the ERC20 tokens and the fees and the scaling is the massive blocker. And people, I think, over the next, look at the price to do a transaction on Ethereum now. It's completely insane. You can't run any kind of microtransaction system where you need fast payments or fast. So how do you build those type of systems on Bitcoin without changing the Bitcoin protocol? So you have the protocols of wallet systems, but they are much more powerful than I think people realize. So if you look at the Bitcoin layers, you have so the Bit32, you have the purpose layer, you have the coin type, you have the accounts, you have the change, and you have the address index. So that index is the 5th layer in that derivation pathway within the wallet ecosystem, and that ticks over everything. It's like any ID for any database. When you create a transaction, it ticks up 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. The earlier ones, the further down the tree you go, they are fixed. So that is fixed to the pathway is 44 for a BSV wallet, because it responds to the structure that is in bit 44. So it always starts with M-44, and then you have 0, 0, 0, 0. That N0 for the first transaction is 1. The second one is 2. All of the others are all binary. So you can use a software overlay system. So if you incorporate a wallet into a program that you are running locally, you can use your wallet as both a communication device with the blockchain, but you can also have it as an identity device that references an attested ID or identity, passport, photos, all of these things for you as a user, so that applications can sign into you. So that flips the whole system on its head. So traditionally with Facebook and Google, you require to sign in physically. You then have to put in your username and password. That password is stored probably on Google Chrome somewhere as your history. That's stored in your app data. You then now sign in to another account using Facebook. Okay, Facebook doesn't control the application you're going in, but it has the cookie information about your identity and what you're doing, so that even when you're not using their application, if you're using it to sign in, then they have that data. So if you've been looking for, I don't know, plants at some nursery online, you will see adverts for the things that you've been looking for. And that's powered by the sale of your information from Facebook. So they want to know the interaction history. It has a value because it's your browsing data. They're collating information about you, even if you're not logged in, if you're using these third-party sign-in things. So the identity system is one side. So you can attest identity on chain and then reference a file or something that has been with a third-party authenticator. So if you're doing KYC or you're doing AML through a third party, you can then link the two together and say this transaction has a timestamp. It's been authenticated by me as someone with a connected wallet. And then you can also have revocation as well on these files. So you can say that this file is valid for a period of 12 months, and then you have to revalidate your identity for you to log into your wallet and prove who you are and prove that your address is within the same system, so that if you go over any limitations within a service, then you then flag the alerts and they say, is this person who they say they are? So you can do identity on chain where you are no longer passing your information directly to someone and saying, look, this is the picture of me, this is my photo ID. You can attest privately through a registered and regulated entity. And you can then validate any authentication sequence within a schema of information. So say, for instance, you're a 17-year-old girl and you want to buy alcohol in the UK where the ID age is 18. So you can go in and say you had a system where you have your phone app and you want to validate something or pay for something using Bitcoin. You can then go through to the identity section of your wallet, which will validate. The validation concept is this person 18? Are they valid for making this person? It's not who is this person, where do they live, send me a picture of your ID, send me a copy of a driving license, are you male or female? You process that information that's now sat on someone's server in order for them to sell your details. All you need to know is it's a binary yes or no. Is this person of age to make this process? Yes. None of the information that you've attested to is then passed on to a third party. You as the wallet owner are in control of your data. You can, so rather than have the change area, so the fourth area in wallet systems is where the change goes. So you know how the UTXO system of wallets works. So I always use the grocer contract example. And I was talking to my son, my 8-year-old boy, who asked me a question last night, and he was talking about POS systems, and we were talking about money and change as in physical coins. And he said, Dad, if someone goes into a shop and the payment system doesn't work, how do they know how much change to give you? Because it always tells you on the screen.
Smart boy.
You give them, so you go in, you give them a £10 note and you spend £3.20 or $3.20 in a $10 note. How do you work it out? So he was asking more about the maths, but I was saying, okay, if you tie that back into Bitcoin and the UTXO set, that whole process of handing over a note, and I know that Craig's spoken about this many times as well, it's the process of understanding not only the change, but the original, it's called the grocer's contract. So when I was a kid, they didn't have all these typing machines. They had to physically count out. So if you spent £3.20, how would they authenticate? How would you contract with them for them giving you your change? They wouldn't just go in and take the change out and put it in your hand and go, there you go. So £3.20, if you look at the denominations in the UK in pound sterling, it's different obviously because you have dimes and quarters and stuff. There's 25s and 5s. But in the UK, you have pence, 1 pence, 2 pence, 5, 10, 20, 50, £1 coins. There's no £1 note, but I remember £1 notes. I'm that old. And then a £5 and then 10. So how do you do the change as a contract between you and a grocer? So you're going to buy some sweets as a kid and it comes to £3.20. How do you then go through the process? So you go 10, 10, 10, 50, 5. So you'd go £3.20 and they'd count it physically in your hand. They'd count from the number, the price, and they'd count up to the number that you've given them back, which is £10. So they say £3.20 and they do the tens, £3.20, £3.30, £3.40, £3.50, and 50 is 4 plus 1 is 5, and a £5 note is 10. That process of counting it into your hands is like the way that the UTXO set happens. That grocer's contract means that they've counted it into your hands. You have accepted.
I'm sorry, I've just got such a nostalgic memory. That's giving me such a blast from the past of being a kid, going to the store and spending in cash for once.
I haven't used cash. I have not used cash in 10 years.
Yeah, it's insane.
At all.
It's insane.
That process is actually called the grocer's contract. So in today, you go to a shop, you give them a note if you pay for cash, and they give you the change. They just count the change in their hand, take it out, and put it in your hand, and you can either count it in front of them and look at what's there and match it with a number on the screen. But the grocer's contract is then counting it out into your hand. And if you then put that change in your pocket, that is the contract complete. You can't then go in your pocket and say, actually, you've mischecked. So it's that doing me out of change. And as a kid, I remember, you remember Dodgems, you go to the fun fair and you give them the token and the guys are jumping on the back of the cars and you give them the money and they give you the change. Well, what they used to do is they'd take all these different pound coins or 20 pence pieces and they put them in your hand and they count them out to you And because most of them are traveling families and they're all dodgy people, most of them, they get the coin and they put the first one in and they tap the coin as if they're giving it to you, and they keep it in there. It's the sleight of hand, and they put the change in. So these kids would make a fortune because they're doing the change contract, but they're not actually giving you the money back. They're tapping it. Yeah. So that's the whole way that this change system works. So within the change area, you have 0 or 1. It's a binary yes or no. So you make a transaction. So imagine an envelope with $10 in or £10, and that transaction is £3.20 or $3.20. I have to give you the envelope, and in order to complete the transaction, you have to give me the change. So in the derivation path of that wallet, the change goes into its own change path. So the UTXO set is actually its own blockchain. You can do something called a coin join, where you'd actually join those and you get rid of all the different UTXO sets. It becomes one set. But
question on that in particular, with mining, where mining's going, 0 fee transactions.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you feel as the longest established commercial miner about where 0 fees is going? Do you feel it undermines the economic incentives of Bitcoin, or do you think it's a necessary jolt in order to spur density on chain right now that we'll think about the effects later?
I don't think it's a necessary jolt. It has very few use cases, but there are use cases when it comes to private contracting. So if you look at the merchant API system now on BSV, it allows you to contract directly with a miner. So I always see this as a peer and seed and leeching thing. So if you go back to the days of BitTorrent, and you understand, so these are one of the concepts that I try to get people can understand if they've used something like BitTorrent. If you've ever used peer-to-peer networking, and you understand that when you request a file or you request a transaction, when you always have the hierarchy of the availability of the files that you're searching for. And you're always looking for the file with the most amount of seeds, i.e. the people who have the whole file and are serving it as the whole file. You have those who have a partial seed, which have partial file. And then you have the leeches. The leeches are the ones that are taking and not giving back. And you always want a really good ratio. The higher the ratio of the seeds, you want at least a 3-to-1 ratio for an uninterrupted download. And obviously, you don't download that from one person. It's split into concatenated chunks, and you can receive pieces of those from different people within the peer system to create a file. So if you look at Bitcoining as mining, as the ones who are actually having mining nodes, as the seeders, they are the ones that have all the information. They have a complete history of everything. And then if you look at, say, the BTC camp, and you have all these different Raspberry Pis, they are the leeches because they're not actually providing any propagation. They're not actually doing any proof of work. And the ones that are only actually hashing. So hashing is only one function of Bitcoin. It doesn't do all the other functions that are required for mining. So these people are actually leeching from the system. So that analogy is really important to understand when it comes to when people say, oh, BTC's got 11,000 miners. It's like, no, they don't. They have between 8 and 30 at any one time. Yeah. So if you look at it like that in terms of hashing and computing power and everything. So when you're talking about 0 fees. So I'll give you an example of how 0 fees can be used. So if you're contracting, say I have a whole load of video that I want to upload, and I know that if I'm going to use an op return as the payload for using something like the BCAP protocol, where you're concatenating very, very small individual transactions with maybe 100 kilobytes of information, kilobytes of information per transaction, what you're doing is you're creating loads and loads of transactions, and you're essentially creating streaming media. But in terms of cost of media, and you compare that to something like Amazon S3 as a storage service, say you want to store video on chain. I've got loads of videos on chain. That's the quickest way to inflate, to get really good block sizes by having information that is storage media or certainly streaming data. So 8K, 4K video. So how do you serve that? So maybe you have a contract with a miner that actually has an indexing service. So something like Matter Cloud or something like Beco Media, for instance. Now I know they have very specialized mining infrastructures behind them, and sometimes they post it off to somebody else for doing some of the other mining functions. But in terms of indexing transactions, that would be considered a specialist mining operation. So it's not just creating and propagating a block. You may want to request and actually use computational power to retrieve that information back. So you can either retrieve it real time, or you can store it for serving later. And you can do that via meme type. You can do it via extensions. So you can say, imagine Google when they first came out, they have to differentiate between what's a video file, what's a picture, what's a document, a PDF. And if you can search then by the extension, you can then start caching, and you can then start having local versions that you can reference the original transaction on chain. And the great thing about that is that you have hash. So you can compare the hash of one function with the hash of another function. As long as they match, you know it is an exact copy of that file. So you can have a local version as well. So if you can have an MAPI, a MAPI connection with a merchant API with a miner. So you could go to Tal, and you could actually use that API to say, I am going to produce over this period of time this amount of data. I want to have a special rate. I don't want to pay 0.5 Satoshis per byte. I want to pay 0.01. And they could say, okay, these aren't little tiny microtransactions. These are now big payloads. These are now 30 megabyte files per file, or 300 megabytes, or 700, whatever. It's an arbitrary figure. If you want to be competitive against the, bearing in mind, this is just storage information. It's exactly the same as S3 in terms of miners being able to store that information. And to be honest, they only need to store that for a small amount of time, because they can prune most of the actual data within the payload away. There's no reason for a miner to keep all that data if it's not being used. Other services will then index it. They can index it, they can reference it. And you as your wallet, you as the service provider also have, you have buried within a block, you have all the information it takes for you to recreate the information that is now missing, that the miner has now discarded. So you're not discarding anything. The shadow, the watermark of where that data was, is included and buried under blocks within the hash and the block header. You can use those two, and you can use SPV to do this. If SPV is done properly, you can actually calculate the contents of data that was there, especially if you as the wallet provider have a reference to that as well, and you have a copy yourself. So you're using that as a copy, and you can have service providers that will provide the payload or the data that was in that block that the miners will later prune away. So you can say, oh, but 5 years' time, that is going to disappear. No, there's always economic incentives for people to keep that data. If it's required data and it's being used.
But do you see that economic incentive always being paid in the underlying native token of the network? That our Satoshi is always going to be useful is what I'm asking here.
Satoshis will always be useful. They'll always be useful because they are the denomination of Bitcoin. Bitcoins, as in Bitcoin's lowercase b, as in the 2.1 million, that is not the denomination of Bitcoin. It's the 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis that are this single floating point integers that Bitcoin uses, and it just so happens to be 100 million of each creates one unit of account.
And that's what I find interesting as well about the biological statement as well, because if you consider your body a composition of cells, each one of the cells have an image of the whole. Bitcoin follows that model, right? So you've got a Satoshi is a single programmable cell, but I do think that zero fees, which to be honest with you is going to be very useful for Gravity and what we're planning in the short term, but I'll be lying if I said I didn't have some medium to long term concerns as to what it means for the network as a whole moving forward for Bitcoin ultimately. Hello, beautiful people. I hope you enjoyed the first episode with Roy Murphy. And if you did, please ensure you like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, make sure you hit that bell icon to ensure that you get the notifications for part 2. Prior to part 2, if the first episode interests you, I think you're really going to like this episode I've done with Craig, which me and Roy speak on. And also probably the other relevant episode will be the episode we done with Nassim, where we talk about Bitcoin and space memory. Until the next time.